Jennie's a qualified town planner and has worked for a number of years now in the residential sector for Westbury Homes, then Harrow Estates, which has then became part of the Redrow PLC. She's particularly got experience on delivering complex sites through the planning system. In May 2014, Jennie moved to be Director of Planning at Taylor Wimpey as the UK Director of Planning, and has oversight on planning matters on behalf of the group. Jennie, we look forward to hearing from you.
Good evening, everybody. Some inspiration and uplifting words from Tina. I particularly like the freedom to feel, Tina. We don't often allow ourselves that particular freedom. Like Stephen, I have 15 minutes. I'm not known for my brevity, but I will try my best, and that might be collected in speed. So let's fasten our seatbelts, guys, and let's go. When I was asked to consider the question, where will our grandchildren live, I found it very difficult to become excited by the spatial, by the geographical. I really believe that we all already know the answer. We've been talking about it for many decades. And I am more concerned about where existing communities will allow our grandchildren to live. Building homes, we need to rely on numerous factors, multiple factors, but those that I'll concentrate on tonight are the politics, the economics and capacity a little, the planning environment a very little, and public attitude, because public attitude influences the politics and therefore the planning of where our new homes will go. So the challenge: to significantly increase new homes, we need and aspire to build across all tenures. We must first address the increasing cultural barriers to development. Now, I have two daughters, 7 and 10. I think I've got about 20 years before I become a grandma. At least I hope so. I have spent most of my last 10 years worrying about where my children will live and not really given an awful lot of thought to where the grandchildren will live. So there is a housing crisis, and it's been decades in the making, and this will be an extremely familiar graph, I'm sure, to most of the audience. Very familiar. What does it show? It shows a significant reduction in local authority and public sector build over time, particularly falling away from the early 1970s, and Clive mentioned some of the issues responding to that. We're now very heavily reliant on private sector house building. About 79% of our homes are built by the private sector. So the need, clearly we need. But what do we need? Do we need 200,000, 250,000, 300,000? Well, at the moment it depends which political party you're listening to, and there we have it. It's the one-upmanship between the political parties. They all accept there's a crisis, and that at least is progress. Now, we haven't built 230,000 homes since the 1970s, and the private sector's not done this alone since the 1930s, and in my dip to planning, that was before the planning system. So in capacity terms, we need new entrants to the market and a public build programme, and I don't think that there's one member of the private housing sector that would deny that we welcome new entrants, and the more competition and the more diversity, the better. And I'm not intending to dissect planning. I would need more than 15 minutes to do that, but it is worth pausing, and I want you specifically to look at 1991 on the graph, because it's a very important date from my point of view. 1991 saw the introduction of the plan-led system, and I don't think that you can deny the impact. Planning is certainly one of our challenges. So the population keeps growing, households keep forming, supply keeps falling, it leads to affordability issues, overcrowding, and you'll have heard all the math before, and I'm not going to worry you with it. In spatial terms, where should our housing go, and where will our grandchildren live? Well, really quickly, mainly in cities, of course, in sustainable urban extensions on both brownfield and greenfield developments, around nodes of public transport and infrastructure such as HS2. Mostly, but not exclusively, in the south and Greater London, but that's not to diminish the economic importance of delivering housing need and demand in the northern cities and in secondary towns. Some will be in garden cities. Some of it, I think, will be in Greenbelt, particularly if we're to avoid unsustainable travel habits. And on the 3 questions on your little ticket, it's all of the above. So, the house, the child's house. We talk about type, we talk about construction methods of future housing, sustainability, modern off-site technologies, carbon neutral. Stephen's talked about the challenges on energy consumption, and there are others who are far more qualified to talk about that. Let me say, first of all, I'm not a revisionist, but I am a realist. I believe we must do all of these things and more, but when it comes to homes, guys, we are an extremely conservative nation. The home my granddaughter, I've decided she's going to be a girl, will be remarkably similar on the outside at least to the home that I, and indeed my mother, who was born in 1927, lived in. With the exception of the colour of the smoke, which emanates from the chimney, the home will be remarkably similar. But there's more reason for this than just the conservatism. In the decade between 1999 and 2009, we added just 7.8% to the housing stock in England. At the current rate of build, which is about 130,000 home starts last year, the next 20 years we would deliver 2.6 million. That's about 10%, maybe a bit less. If we add 250,000 homes every year for the next 20 years, that's 5 million homes. Whoop-de-doo, that's 20%. So given the current housing stock of about 23.5 million, it's going to take a significant amount of time to affect social behaviour, typologies, characters, and change of any meaning. The chances are that my grandchildren will live in a home which already exists. So you need to understand, and there needs to be a greater understanding, that new homes, whilst very important, do not drive behaviour. They rarely call the market, they follow the market. The second-hand market drives almost all housing economics and taste. And like it or not, that's what drives house builders to build the types of houses that we build today. On house type, the highest demand is for houses. The growth in living alone is greatly exaggerated. Few people aspire to live alone. Flats as a typology are unattractive and unsustainable in market terms at high levels. A very high proportion of the apartments that were built in the last cycle masked a deep trend and a chronic mismatch to the housing delivery and household demand. And please notice, I'm using household demand. I'm not talking about need. Our future homes are likely to be dominated by houses. And so geographically too, we're unlikely to turn that tanker in 20 years. We'll be adding to existing settlements. There's been a lot of discussion about garden cities, and I think that the garden city principles are worthy and venerable. And garden cities will contribute, but given their complexity and the infrastructure requirements, they'll only have started delivering in the next 20 years. Clive mentioned the Lions Review, and I had very quickly flicked through it before I left my office, and I was very, very interested and not a little pleased, I have to say, to find that this graph is in it. This, I think, is actually a really, really interesting graph. Housing is socio-political and spatial. It's cultural, and in my view, above all other obstacles, a change in public attitude to new housing is the key. The National Housing Federation issued this document. It's called The Politics of Housing. I don't agree with the political motivation to the delivery of new housing. The first is the nature and visibility of the problem. The second is the interests and aspirations for voters. And the third is political and economic ideology. Put very simply, the less visible the problem and the less social cohesion, the weaker the desire and the need to solve the problem. This is an amazing graph, and it reveals lots. Most importantly, it reveals that it has got very little to do with the political party in power at the time, and it also has very little to do with the economic climate at the time, but everything to do with the political response to the public attitude to housing at the time. So on the x-axis are the percentage of manifesto dedicated to housing issues, and on the y-axis are the elections and the political parties at the time. And you can see that during times of very visible supply problems, especially in the mid-40s and 50s, we made remarkable progress in addressing poor housing and addressing housing need. The period proves that we can do it. It proves, if you could remember the previous graph in terms of how much housing we were able to deliver, that we can deliver 250,000 homes as a nation. The New Towns Commission took 9 months before the New Town Act, and 27 new towns were declared. Can you imagine that happening today? 9 months. Now and in the immediate future, our housing problem is one of future growth in household numbers, not visible failure. And it seems that this less tangible motivating force is having difficulty taking root with the voting population. Action to address this need is predicated on a concern for our future generations. And in February, Ipsos Mori put housing 9th on the list of issues, up 1 from January. I attended some of the party conferences. It certainly was climbing the agenda, and the question is whether it will get high enough. So, given that public attitudes to housing are affected by their own outlook, one of the things that I think is most interesting is a look at our home ownership profile. Home ownership in the UK is not really all that different to a number of our European neighbours, Spain, Italy, Ireland, all have similar levels of home ownership. Our home ownership reached its peak about 2003 at over 70%, but it's fallen back in recent years, and it now sits about 65%. In regions such as Yorkshire and Humber, where affordability is a little easier, just a little easier, it remains high. Home ownership plays an extremely important role in the attitudes of voters, and it's a fact, not a stereotype. It's a fact that homeowners tend to be more anti-development than those in other tenures. So look at the age profile on the graph of home ownership. It's aging quite rapidly, and John referenced homes for an aging population, which is another large topic. And there's been a substantial decline in the number of homeowners under 30. Now, you know all of this, of course, and the pattern deepened from the crisis in 2007. So add to the ageing home ownership profile an inherent desire to maintain the status quo in terms of house prices, both personally and politically, add in pension insecurity and other things. This homeowner is protective of the asset, and they see new development as a negative, and having a negative impact on the asset. Now, there are lots of reasons why they have a view that development is negative, and I accept some of it is design quality and infrastructure pressures, but not all of it. John helped me out there with his beautiful scheme. I mean, why would someone oppose something that looks so good? This group of politically active homeowners is catchily called the insiders. On the other end of the demographic, we can see that the younger generations are finding it increasingly difficult to get on the housing ladder. They've got a high percentage of non-housing debt, like student debt. House prices are increasing, affordability is falling, and there are significant barriers to entry. And these are called the outsiders. So we have insiders and outsiders. Now, if we're going to talk about politics, we need to look at voting behaviour. So electoral activity is key to political influence and therefore drivers in housing policy. So you see that the age groups with the most significant home and equity holdings, those insiders, take an active part defining political agendas and driving political behaviour and the behaviour of the political parties. The influencers, a few influencing the outcome for the many. The 18 to 34-year-old cohort, which makes up about 26% of the population, are said to be the social trendsetters. They will set social trends, but look at the voting record. They're not engaging, they're not driving political influence to achieve future positive outcomes, particularly in housing. Really simply, politicians, both local and national, listen to those who elect them. So, planning. Finally, planning in the age of localism is now more engaged than ever. Community engagement. So we have steering groups, we have workshops, and we have village meetings. And we engage with them as a business, as an industry. We are now dedicated to participation and community engagement. But we engage with those who wish to participate, and that becomes a problem. The national parties recognise that there is housing need, but we continue to struggle to persuade people on the ground. whilst politicians want to see housing supply increase, they have a sensitive balance. As a political party, they can't really tip it too far because they don't want to alienate their electorate. Those who are engaged wield a disproportionate power over planning policy. They're overrepresented, in my view, in the housing debate. They don't believe household projection models that indicate a housing crisis exists now or in the future. That's why so many local plans are being found unsound, sorry to get a bit techie, at the earliest stages of their examinations. About 50% are falling over at the first hurdle because they're failing to meet their housing needs. And that's because local politicians are reflecting the views of their communities. Because for this group, and I think this is probably the point that I most want to make, there's no visible issue for housing undersupply. They don't see homelessness increasing, they can't see the overcrowding. It isn't as obvious as the slums and squalor of the post-war housing provision. The NPPF, the National Planning Policy Framework, did introduce some rebalancing, and we've seen housing permissions increase as a result. And the balance is tilted, but we can see tensions looming now that the elections are on their way. Neighbourhood plans carrying more weight than an advanced local plan. No greenbelt releases unless locally supported. No garden cities unless locally supported. Planning for housing at scale, predicated on locally derived support, is a phenomenal ask, and I'm not sure that we're capable of achieving it. So the case is clear, from my point of view, for a stable and mature political dialogue. The reason for opposition moves with the argument. So housing isn't needed. It isn't affordable anyway. It's not going to be for local people, or it's closed in other agendas, hands off our land, no development on greenbelt, no development on greenfield land, build on brownfield. But you know, brownfield isn't a panacea, and I know a lot about brownfield land. It can be part of a solution, a positive part of a solution. It's the current path of least resistance and the next battleground. It's as strongly opposed, let me tell you from personal experience, as greenfield land. Remember, even urban intensification is going to come under the cosh because developing gardens isn't brownfield anymore. And all this causes delay and conflict. 5.6 million for John, 12 years, ties us up in examinations and planning committees and judicial reviews. We spend a significant amount of time and resources in community engagement, and there's some very real examples of positive outcomes. But sadly, the best outcomes tend to be where the principle of development has already been forced either through a local plan allocation or been won at appeal. It remains challenging to persuade existing communities that their housing is needed and that they ought to act. So, how do we get to the yes? Short-term housing policies have driven by single-term administrations, both locally and nationally, is what's resulted in the situation that we have. 20 years in the making, it'll be at least 20 years in the solving. If we want to maintain local decision-making, and I believe that we should, we need robust long-term policies working across political parties that are less susceptible to electoral point scoring. We need to educate communities to think of future generations and make the impact of the crisis more visible. We need to inspire today's young people to participate, to join the debate and get active, and I particularly feel really passionate about that. We need to engage communities and allow them to talk to the people who want to join their community, and to increase the volume of the people with that view and dilute the influence of those few. We need a cultural shift in our housing debate. In my view, we need to make it socially unacceptable to say no. Thank you.